Word.
I see
Oh,
recording.
there we are. Now we're good. Okay, so this is basic program first year class. We're in the winter semester, the tutorial. We are reading Aristotle's Ethics, and for this class, we have read book 3 on courage and self-control. And we're reading pretty much at the rate of a book a week, so next week will be book 4. But before he gets into specific virtues, he still has a lot more to say in the first 6 chapters about moral action and choice and responsibility. So all of these chapters seem to circle around the theme of, there are plenty of times we act and do things and make moral choices or do moral actions, and it's not actually coming from us. We may be acting under constraint. We may be acting under ignorance. There's all kinds of reasons we're doing what we do. And so he talks about those cases and how can you judge whether someone's actually responsible for their actions. So let's maybe start at the very beginning of chapter 1 of book 3. So it's entitled Actions, Voluntary and Involuntary. And James, would you read at the very beginning there?
Sure. Virtue or excellence is, as we have seen, concerned with emotions and actions. When these are voluntary, we receive praise and blame. When involuntary, we are pardoned and sometimes even pitied. Therefore, it is, I dare say, indispensable for a student of virtue to differentiate between voluntary and involuntary actions, and useful also for lawgivers to help them in meting out honors and punishments. It is, of course, generally recognized that actions done under constraint or due to ignorance are involuntary. An act is done under constraint when the initiative or source of motion comes from without. It is the kind of act in which the agent or the person acted upon contributes nothing. For example, a wind might carry a person somewhere he did not want to go, or men may do so who have him in their power. But a problem arises in regard to actions that are done through fear of a greater evil or for some noble purpose. For instance, if a tyrant were to use a man's parents or children as hostages in ordering him to commit a base deed, making their survival or death depend on his compliance or refusal. Are actions of this kind voluntary or involuntary? A similar problem also arises when a cargo is jettisoned in a storm. Considering the action itself, nobody would voluntarily throw away property, but when it is a matter of saving one's own life and that of his fellow passengers, any sensible man would do so. Actions of this kind are then of a mixed nature, although they come closer to being voluntary than to being involuntary actions. For they are desirable at the moment of action, and the end for which an action is performed depends on the time at which it is done. Thus, the terms voluntary and involuntary are to be used with reference to the moment of action. In the cases just mentioned, the agent acts voluntarily because the initiative of moving the parts of the body which act as instruments rests with the agent himself, and where the source of motion is within oneself, it is in one's power to act or not to act. Such actions then are voluntary, although in themselves they are perhaps involuntary, since nobody would choose to do any one of them for its own sake. Oops. You're on mute, Cynthia.
Thank you. Sorry. Because I've got a cold, I'll be muting myself a lot for coughs. So you might have to put up a flag like you just did and say, yo, we're not hearing you. So he gives us some difficult cases here, and let's maybe talk through them. We don't always get examples from Aristotle, but in this case, we've got a couple. So let's maybe start with the cargo example. You're on a ship and you jettison cargo. It's a matter of saving your life and the life of your fellow passengers. Voluntary or involuntary?
Voluntary with cause.
Okay.
So you don't have to throw it over.
It's a choice.
It's not like being kidnapped and carried somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like losing the cargo to pirates, which would be the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to save yourself? You got to throw it over. But as he says, you voluntarily lift up the cargo and toss it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say voluntary with cause.
Okay. And he does add, and I think this is the equivalent of your with cause, since nobody would choose to do it for its own sake.
Yeah.
If you didn't need to, nobody would pick up, well, no sensible person would pick up cargo and throw it overboard.
Right. The greater or lesser of two evils.
Mm-hmm.
And
but it
notice
says
that in the first paragraph, he says it's necessary for us as students of virtue to differentiate between voluntary and involuntary, but it's also necessary for lawgivers.
right.
So you could imagine the owner of that cargo, when the ship reaches port, discovering that a lot of his cargo has been thrown overboard, and he's now out, has a big loss, perhaps suing.
Mhm.
Athens was pretty famous for being litigious, so I'm guessing there were such lawsuits, and that part of the thing the jury had to consider is, would a sensible person have said, "I got to do this to save my life," and then maybe we don't think that they have to pay the man for the cargo.
but
And
he
it's also,
says
if you save your life, you're going to save the ship.
Yeah.
he says
I want it to
actions
think.
Go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
actions of this kind are then of a mixed nature,
Mm-hmm.
although they come closer to being voluntary than to being involuntary actions. For
Mm-hmm.
they are desirable at the moment of action, and the end for which an action is performed depends on the time in which it's done. But
Mm-hmm.
no, it's just that first sentence I said. It's mixed.
Yes.
Closer to voluntary.
Mm-hmm.
So I think where I look is the first paragraph where it said, if it is involuntary, we might be pardoned and even pitied.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not necessarily bad. I think the way we might think the question is being posed, it's good or bad. And it just, to me, it's right now, it's just an objective distinction. Did your body do it, or was it forced to do it?
Mm-hmm.
And, and if it was voluntary, but it was voluntary, but not, actually, I didn't lose my train of thought. I'm actually wrong in what I was thinking. Is because I was thinking it's, involuntary can be pardoned and pitied. But this one, I guess, was voluntary.
Yeah.
Meaning he threw the cargo off.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking, my underlying model is Hercules in one of the plays who goes mad and kills sheep. But if somebody were made mad by the gods to think that the ship is in a storm and throws the cargo over because of madness, that sounds involuntary
Mm-hmm.
and to be pitied.
Mm-hmm. Well, how about one of the other situations he mentioned? So a tyrant is using a man's parents or children as hostages in order to make him commit a base deed. And you might see some of that in Herodotus. They do tend to take hostages there, making their survival or death depend on his compliance, voluntary or involuntary.
Certainly an element of voluntary, which would assume weighing what the deed does against the parents and family.
Mm-hmm.
Is this killing a king? And would that carry more weight? So the person involved has to make a choice. It would seem to be easy, but it probably isn't all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, then I think of the nasty point at which, gosh, I'm finally rid of those people. But I don't think that's what Aristotle's thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I'd do anything to be rid of my family.
But yeah, this seems to be a case of choosing between two evils.
Yeah.
And you're suggesting, Norm, that maybe it depends on what he's asking you to do.
Yeah.
Is he asking you to commit murder, or is he asking you to lie and cover up one of his crimes?
Right.
Um,
And murder of whom?
hmm
Um,
And is it similar to the throwing away the cargo case in that you voluntarily do it? You could say no,
mhm.
but there's an involuntary aspect to it in that he's holding this over your head.
Yeah, and it would be different if the tyrant were holding the man's goods and
Mm.
threatened to confiscate them if he didn't do it. That's closer to the cargo,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
because it's not people and not family.
Mm-hmm.
So, interesting cases.
Well, then he goes on to talk about other tricky cases of, does this count as voluntary? He talks about acts due to ignorance. What about that? Can you say somebody's not to blame because they did this action in ignorance? And he talks about that a couple pages later, 1110B, around 15 or 20, and where he says, turning now to acts due to ignorance. Bill, are you there?
Yes,
Okay, would you read that?
of course. Turning now to acts due to ignorance, we may say that all of them are non-voluntary, but they are involuntary only when they bring sorrow and regret in their train. A man who has acted due to ignorance and feels no compunction whatsoever for what he has done was not a voluntary agent, since he did not know what he was doing, nor yet was he involuntary, inasmuch as he feels no sorrow. There are therefore two distinct types of acts due to ignorance. A man who regrets what he has done is considered an involuntary agent, and a man who does not may be called a non-voluntary agent, for as the two cases are different, it is better to give each its own name. Should I continue, or?
Yes, do.
There also seems to be a difference between actions due to ignorance and acting in ignorance. A man's action is not considered to be due to ignorance when he is drunk or angry, but due to intoxication and anger, although he does not know what he is doing, and it is in fact acting in ignorance. Now every wicked man is in a state of ignorance as to what he ought to do and what he should refrain from doing, and it is due to this kind of era that men become unjust and in general immoral. But an act can hardly be called involuntary if the agent is ignorant of what is beneficial. Ignorance in moral choice does not make an act involuntary, it makes it wicked, nor does ignorance of the universal, for that invites reproach. Rather, it is ignorance of the particulars which constitute the circumstances and the issues involved in the action. It is on these that pity and pardon depend, for a person who acts in ignorance of a particular circumstance acts involuntarily.
Okay, let's stop there. So what does he say about claims of ignorance? That I didn't do that. You can't blame me for that moral action, that immoral action, because I was in ignorance. Does he accept that?
If you say, I didn't know, but I'm sorry.
Okay. So the how you feel about it seems to be a part of it. And a man who has acted due to ignorance and feels no compunction whatsoever for what he has done, he says, was not a voluntary agent since he did not know what he was doing, nor yet was he involuntarily, inasmuch as he feels no sorrow. So what do we make of that? He did a wrong thing in ignorance. So he says that was not voluntary. But because he feels no sorrow,
I'm thinking in kind of modern terms of, what am I trying to say? Where you're sort of expected to know the law. and somebody didn't, and he could say, "You mean I'm doing all this stuff for disobeying that stupid law?"
Ah.
Is certainly
Mhm.
not feeling guilty about it. He might be
Mhm.
unhappy about paying the fine,
Mhm.
but it's more anger. They're making me pay my fine for that stupid little thing that's.
Can you split? Can you split it? Like he's involuntary on one thing, and he's voluntary on his attitude. Like not look at it as just one single simple act, but two things going on there.
Yeah, it seems to be there's two moments of action. One is when you do it, and he says if it was ignorant, then that was not voluntary. But then when you realize what you've done, that's another moment. And if you don't say you were sorry, now you're involuntary.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, getting stopped for a taillight out. Maybe you didn't know it was out, but there's still the possibility of a ticket or a warning. Or just the sense of a law that is obscure, but you're supposed to know it. I didn't know it.
Mm. Yeah, and he does say that this is, I mentioned earlier that this is also for lawgivers. So it's interesting because there's the law, and then there's the policeman who's writing your ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, if you say, "Oh, I am so sorry. I had no idea my taillight was out," that's treated differently. If you say, "Oh, that's a stupid law. Really,
Yeah.
you're stopping me for that, for a taillight?" And you might get treated differently based on your attitude at that moment.
Or who you are. I'm going to
Yes.
step outside. I do young adult lit. The Hate You Give, which was just a movie. The black man who's killed is stopped because a taillight is out.
Mm,
And he doesn't behave exactly properly and ends up being shot.
yeah.
So, and I think one of those where they were after a getaway car of something, or somebody who'd killed somebody, was in the news within maybe the last month or two, was initially stopped for a taillight out or something like that. And that was the excuse to stop the car.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas most of us might not, or it was failure to signal a turn, I think, in that case. Now, probably all of us have failed to signal a turn and not been stopped,
Mm-hmm.
even if there are police in the vicinity.
Yeah, that definitely complicates things.
But this allowed them to stop him, even though he was probably not thinking about signaling a turn when he's trying to get away.
Mm-hmm. Well, this business about knowledge does make him define voluntary action with that in mind. So a couple pages later, we get a definition. This is around 1111A20. And it's just a couple of sentences there. Norm, could you read? It's a short paragraph that starts, "Since an action is involuntary."
Since an action is involuntary when it is performed under constraint or through ignorance, a voluntary action would seem to be one in which the initiative lies with the agent who knows the particular circumstances in which the action is performed.
Okay, let's just stop there. Does that make sense as a definition of voluntary action? So it seems to have two parts, that not only do you have to initiate the action, but you have to know the circumstances. And it sounds like, yeah, makes sense to you, Paul?
Makes sense to me. A lot of this is, common jurisprudence and, how we evaluate, laws, and were they mentally incompetent as of the age of reason, and et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in fact, speaking of the age of reason, on the very next page, he says that actually children and animals, though they have a share in voluntary actions, they don't choose. And this is something that comes up in jurisprudence too. Let's talk about that distinction. So, you know, you would think voluntary and choosing would go together, but he makes the claim in the very next section that choice is something voluntary, but it's not the same. And how do you understand him when he says, for even children and animals have a share in the voluntary, but not in choice? And also, we can describe an act done on the spur of the moment as voluntary, but not as choice. So how does he distinguish choice and voluntary? A child can have voluntary action, an animal can have voluntary action, but a child cannot have choice?
The child does it freely, but without any sense of what it does. I mean, as opposed to being constrained.
Okay, so the does it freely is the voluntary part.
Yeah.
But then what was the part you said, the other half?
Yeah, but doesn't really know what it's doing, doesn't know right from wrong. Takes somebody else's toy to play with. That's why we spend, no, you can't take Susie's toy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not nice. That has to be taught. And at some point it hasn't been. So it's not really choosing yet because it's not knowing it's wrong, but it is taking the thing,
Mm-hmm.
which the child didn't have to do.
Well, and let's talk about how this works out legally, that there are crimes, in fact, which we treat it differently if a child commits it or if an adult commits it. And we have different penalties. Is that related to this? Yes, that child did that action voluntarily, but that child did not choose, and that's why the penalties are different?
Well, it should be. You know,
Mm-hmm.
we make that choice, and that's it's the rightful choice to make, because I don't think that children are necessarily reasonable, rational beings when it comes to, you know, crimes. We're getting away from that. I mean, you know, I know there's some horrendous things done by, you know, minors, but I just, yeah, I think Aristotle's spot on, really, about that.
Mm-hmm. And you're right that you hear, I think it makes the news when there's an exception to that, Paul. You hear, and this child was being charged as an adult for this crime, whereas in the past it was much more common to be charged as a minor.
A 6-year-old finds a loaded gun, points it at somebody else, essentially consciously, because he's seen it on TV, and shoots the person because he doesn't know that's going to happen. And a 5-year-old shoots a 5-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Not the same as a 20-year-old shooting a 20-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And consciously picking up the gun and pointing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a toy.
Well, and at the end of this section, he explains, or at least he puts it as a question, what he thinks is the difference. Let's maybe take a look at how he ends this section, the very last paragraph. Jason, would you read the last paragraph of this section on choice? It
Sure.
starts out, since choice then.
Since choice then is none of the things mentioned, what is it or what kind of thing? As we have said, it clearly seems to be something voluntary, but not everything voluntary is the object of choice. Could it be the result of preceding deliberation? This is probably correct, for choice involves reason and thought. The very name choice seems to suggest that it is something chosen before other things.
Okay. And I think this distinction would be clearer in the Greek. We have a footnote that tells us the Greek word being translated choice here is proeresis. So we see that little word pro at the front. which is before. So there is some idea of thinking before or taking before. Forethought might be a nice way of translating it, or foreknowledge.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, we do have a sense of a legal term, malice aforethought.
Ah, there we go. Yeah.
So
Any-
in the Venn diagram, all choice would be voluntary, but not all voluntary actions would imply choice.
Mm,
What are you trying to say?
I think that is exactly the way he would draw it. Choice seems to be something voluntary, but it is not the same as voluntariness. So animals, children, and adults can have a share in voluntary action, but only adults can choose, can have deliberate forethought.
Is that essentially the same as thought about the result in the future?
That's a good question. Back to Norm's point about the shooting of the gun, that there's some sense that that 5-year-old doesn't really comprehend what that gun's going to do to that person, but that a 20-year-old, we would assume, knows what happens, even if they've never seen it or done it before, knows what happens when you fire a gun into someone's face. And that's why we charge them more harshly. You should have known, even though you've never shot a gun before. You're an intelligent adult human being, you should know.
And should know that it's always possible that it's loaded.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think it was loaded.
Mm. Yeah. Well, and we should add another thing that we've all heard of trials where even seeming adults, 20, 30-year-olds, turn out not to maybe have the mental capacity to do this deliberation. And sometimes they will not be charged then, or be charged with a lesser crime, that they actually did not know
Right.
what was going to happen. But I think you're right, Bill, that the knowledge seems to be about, if I take this step, what will result?
Thanks. I mean, then forethought seems like a good word to me.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but doesn't he use the term wish? Or
Well, he wants to compare it to, what about wishing?
yeah, I need to reread the section, but wishing is having a future result in mind. So you're choosing a course of action to get you, or to get that future result, perhaps.
But wishing, wishing is just wishing. It's not the same as choice.
Yes.
Wishing is kind of the ideal, even unattainable ideal. I think I read this a few days ago.
Mm-hmm. This is section 4, by the way.
You can wish for the impossible, but you can't choose the impossible.
Mm.
But I'm thinking, at least literary terms, the number of characters who wish something would happen negatively to somebody else and then feel very guilty when it does. Even though we assume the wishing did not cause it.
But that's worth noting, that at least some people feel like wishing what you wish is connected to your character.
Yeah.
And he does bring that up here, that somehow the man of high moral standards, his wish and his choice coincide. So let's read a bit about in the wishing chapter. Jason, since you mentioned it, would you pick up, maybe not with the first paragraph, but with the second one, around line 20, where he says, if these consequences are unacceptable?
If these consequences are unacceptable, we must not admit that in an unqualified sense, and from the standpoint of truth, the object of wish is the good, but that for each individual, it is whatever good seems to him. This distinction solves the problem. Thus, what seems good to a man of high moral standards is truly the object of wish, whereas a worthless man wishes anything that strikes his fancy. And is the same with the human body. People whose constitution is good find those things wholesome, which really are so, while other things are wholesome for invalids. And similarly, their opinions will vary as to what is bitter, sweet, hot, heavy, and so forth. Just as a healthy man judges these matters correctly, so in moral questions, a man whose standards are high judges correctly, and in each case, what is truly good will appear to him to be so. Thus, what is good and pleasant differs with different characteristics or conditions, and perhaps the chief distinction of a man with high moral standards is his ability to see the truth in each particular moral question, since he is, as it were, the standard and measure for such questions. The common run of people, however, are misled by pleasure, for though it is not the good, it seems to be, so that they choose the pleasant in the belief that it is good, and avoid pain, thinking that it is evil.
Okay. So even though this chapter is titled Wishing, its focus seems to be elsewhere. He doesn't really actually talk about wishing that much. He talks about pleasures and judging. So what's he trying to say here?
A man with high standards, the moral man, which suggests the kind of training that the book wants you to have, will want the right things. And somebody who doesn't have that training won't. They'll sort of go for pleasure, whereas I'm assuming that for the moral man person, the right choice may mean pain. But the ordinary person won't choose pain.
Well, choices, are important, but why are wishes important? Because as somebody said, my wishes and my choices could be completely different. I could make good moral choices, but, at night before I go to bed, I think, boy, I wish I were a king and had lots and lots of money, and I wish, but I'm not going to do anything about those wishes. It's just the life I would desire. I wish I was as beautiful as so-and-so. Why does it matter what I wish? If my actions are good moral actions?
I think the sense of if you wish it, you really would prefer to be rich, and then you're looking for pleasures. If you wish to be who you are, poor, whatever, that you're happy with it. So that wishes, going into modern language, are maybe in some case subconscious thoughts of what you really want.
Okay. So it does matter what you wish.
Yeah. I know I can't have it, but I really wish I had it. And that tells who you are or who you could be.
Well, and I think you mentioned earlier that you see in novels and in real life, people being startled when a secret wish happens.
Yeah.
A bad secret wish. I wish something terrible would happen to so-and-so, or, and there's a feeling of guilt. And I think that is related to the idea that we don't think our wishes are completely neutral.
Right.
There's something wrong about wishing a terrible thing to happen to someone and then it does.
Yeah.
But the person of high moral standards, their wishes and their actions will be more in conjunction.
Yeah, it's not that perhaps subconscious kind of thing that really wants something else. I want what's best in this moral sense.
And he compares it to the healthy person. I wonder what people think of that comparison, that people whose constitution is good will wish good things. But invalids get confused and judge incorrectly.
Yeah. And it's almost as if they somehow can't judge what the real taste is. This is to an objective person, this particular food is bitter, but the invalid isn't going to taste it that way. Maybe something with the taste buds or whatever, or everything tastes bad, which is maybe more the case.
Yeah. Well, and let me try that on with an example maybe from the Meno, since you all have read that.
Mm-hmm.
So at one point when Meno is asked to define what the good is, one of his early definitions is it's to help your friends and harm your enemies. And I have a feeling Socrates he doesn't immediately object. They examine that answer, and eventually even Meno rejects it. But I wonder if that's the kind of thing that the man of high moral standards, to your point, Norm, would immediately go, well, that's not right. And that's not what I would wish. You know, before I go to bed at night, I won't pray or wish, oh, I wish bad things happen to my enemies and good things happen to my friends.
Yeah, yeah.
The man of high moral standards would know that's not a good wish.
But I think he's almost approaching it from the other side, which is not even necessarily saying a good man will not wish for bad things, but well, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. If you wish for bad things, then you're not a good man. I mean,
okay, the other way.
Yeah.
It all has to be lined up in a way. You know, it's not, you certainly have to have good actions, but you got to have good actions for the right reasons towards the right wishes.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If you have these wishes, by definition, you are not a good man.
Mm-hmm. And can you change that? Can you say, I need to stop wishing these bad wishes? Or are your wishes just a reflection of who you are?
I would think, and from various religious positions, Eastern and other, you should be able to change the wishing.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a discipline. It might be saying, no, I won't wish that.
Mm-hmm.
But in a way, maybe it's like habit. And that you can learn.
Loving
I think at a
kindness
Buddhist level,
practices. Loving kindness practices in Buddhism.
Yeah.
Where it's a real practice. It's sort of set things that you do to feel good about yourself, and expanding it out to other people, and finally to the worst people that you have the worst feelings about. And you do it over and over. I went to a 2-week retreat just on that.
Okay.
But anyway, that means that they would think that you could change your thinking.
Well, and that's nice. He doesn't talk about prayers, but some of our talk about wishes is not unlike that.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking, Chris, someone who at the end of their day, various people have done them wrong in the course of the day. And they say either at the end of the day or at various times, oh, I wish something bad would happen to those people who did me wrong. Mm-hmm. Versus an attempt to become, more thoughts of loving kindness. I send good thoughts out to everybody who's either done me harm or done me good today. I send good thoughts their way, or I pray for them. And that actually will, they say, over time, change your attitude. Yeah. So that you won't.
It is also Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who
as we forgive.
Yeah. I think we say it right. And in Catholicism, and probably most of Christianity, is free will, which is you're not predetermined to be good or bad. You're a lot of this, when I'm reading this, thinking about my religious upbringing, which was strong, of it's up to you. You have free will. You have to make choices. We have prayers, not wishes. Very similar. For my learning here, a little bit is kind of the evolution of where all this thought was from. Not that it's a surprise, but it's interesting to see the links.
Mm-hmm. In the next section, back to we're seeing the origin and the links of some of these things. He says some things that I think modern morality might disagree with a little, which is he talks about things like alcoholism, and we would say drug addiction and things. and is deciding, is that an excuse you can make, or are you responsible for that? And I think here his thoughts might differ a little from modern theorists. So we're in the section man as responsible agent, section 5. Let's start around line 30, where he says even ignorance is in itself. Let's see, who has not read yet? Paul?
What page is that on, please?
On mine, it's 65.
65, and it's
line 30 on the side, and it starts out even ignorance.
Okay. Even ignorance is in itself no protection against punishment if a person is thought to be responsible for his ignorance. For example, the penalty is twice as high if the offender acted in a state of drunkenness because the initiative is his own. He had the power not to get drunk, and drunkenness was responsible for his ignorance. However, punishment is inflicted for offenses committed in ignorance of such provisions of the law as the offender ought to have known or might easily have known. It is also inflicted in other cases in which ignorance seems to be due to negligence. It was in the offender's power not to be ignorant, it is argued, and he could have made sure had he wanted to.
Now I'm going to have you skip a paragraph and jump to the moreover.
Moreover, it is unreasonable to maintain that a man who acts unjustly or self-indulgently does not wish to be unjust or self-indulgent. If a man is not ignorant of what he is doing when he performs acts which will make him unjust, he will of course become unjust voluntarily, nor again can wishing any more make him stop being unjust and become just that it can make a sick man healthy. Let us assume the case of a man who becomes ill voluntarily through living a dissolute life, disobeying doctor's orders. In the beginning, before he let his health slip away, he could have avoided becoming ill. But once you had thrown a stone and let it go, you can no longer recall it, even though the power to throw it was yours, for the initiative was within you. Similarly, since an unjust or self-indulgent man initially had the possibility not to become unjust or self-indulgent, he has acquired these traits voluntarily, but once he has acquired them, it is no longer possible for him not to be what he is.
Okay, let's stop there and talk about what he's saying here about, he certainly says, we are responsible for our own actions, but yet he says people can get into such a state that it's no longer possible for them to behave justly. They're so far into addiction of some kind, or they've let their body, go so far that it looks like they don't have a choice anymore. But the claim seems to be, yes, but they did way back when the whole thing started. Does that make sense to people? And do we hold that same idea now, or do we?
Oh, we absolutely hold that same idea. I mean, but does a prudent, intelligent person, who maybe understands alcoholism or addiction, knows that it's truly a disease? But do we hold that true? Absolutely, we hold it true. Even the jurisprudence, we hold it true.
Let me ask about the jurisprudence, though, because he says, and I'm going to take him in his word, that in Athens, if two people steal, and one of those people was drunk when he stole, the person who was drunk is going to get twice the penalty. Whereas I guess I wonder, in our system, couldn't someone claim, what, Judge, I was drunk and I didn't know, I thought I was picking up my own diamond necklace. In my drunken stupor, I thought that was mine, and that's why I took it home. And might he not get a lesser penalty for the drunk saying, yeah, he was drunk and he didn't really know what he was doing?
Well,
that's a very different attitude. Yeah, go ahead.
It's, of course, that's possible. And yes, I mean, in reality and rationality, that probably is true from, but I'm not an attorney, but that surely would probably depend. I don't think it'd be a very objective. That would be a subjective thing on which judge you were facing there, because I think that would be taken into account. Now, we as a society understand, we've evolved, alcoholism is a disease. Drug addiction is a disease. So, but, you know, maybe, you know, but I would say most people think that there is a voluntary aspect to that. I'm saying most people, not the way we should think.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you know, I think he kind of alluding to, okay, you know, what about those people that just ate everything what they shouldn't have, but they may actually have a disease too. They may have a compunction to do it. And now, you know, they're 200 pounds from where they should be and by the doctor's orders, but, you know, there may be some psychological reason for it too. So we have, you know, what we should do and what our real standards are two different things. And I think Aristotle, he's spot on and about the results of it. I think we've evolved a little bit as a society, though. At least we hope we have. So, and recognizing those things.
I'd want to separate alcoholism from specific drunkenness.
Okay.
Got the story down on the south side of the big church school celebration in Orland, where the retired priest drank a lot and hit and killed one of the teachers, leaving Orland, leaving the restaurant, and didn't pay any attention to it. They were looking at involuntary manslaughter, but they didn't know who did it for over a day. And so by the time they identified him, it was too late to do breathalyzer, so there was no evidence of drunkenness. But he was not necessarily an alcoholic. He was just drinking a lot at a party, which, you know, there's certainly enough warnings about don't drink and drive. So the choices an alcoholic has to make, knowing he or she is subject to this, and are knowing that it's something physical, genetic, whatever, I think that would sway Aristotle if he knew it. But being drunk, even from a party, even from friends, without being an alcoholic,
but
you should know.
But he, before a judge, if he didn't use the story that he was drunk, and therefore didn't hit the person, he'd be better off than if they found that he was drunk and killed another person.
Well, he certainly would have been better off.
There are no charges.
In Aristotle's day, he would have been better off.
Right.
Because they would have considered it two offenses. The one offense was the crime you did. The other was that you were drunk, and double the fine, whatever it was.
The same morals. I mean, you know, I like to think that we're in a, you know, enlightened society where we recognize the, you know, the involuntary component of addictions or call it vices of various kinds. The stigma still remains. I mean, the homeless people and the drunks that I see on the train every day are definitely treated with a derision or at best indifference that points to, you know, collective belief in a moral failing along the way. Even if we give lip service to, you know, disease or somehow it being involuntary. So Aristotle's version of ethics still prevails, like it or not.
I mean, there's a difference between an alcoholic who goes, whether it's AA or whatever other program, and consciously is not drinking and avoiding it, and an alcoholic that doesn't try to stop.
Fair.
Whatever legally the issue would be. I mean, obviously the one person is not drunk and the other person is.
He also, at the very end of what we read, makes it sound like you can become far, even though you're making choices, and this is now apart from addiction. He just says somebody who has made themselves unjust or self-indulgent has acquired those traits voluntarily, but once he's acquired them, it's no longer possible for him not to be what he is. Now, does that make it sound like you can actually, though you made voluntary choices to get there, you can get to a state where you can't make good choices anymore? You know, his example is the body, the sick man. who's done everything wrong. And you could imagine a day when the doctor talks to him and says, now your health is just gone. And the guy says, oh, but now I'll be good. Now I'll eat the right things and exercise. And the doctor says, no, you don't. What I'm telling you is it's too late. Your body cannot recover anymore. You have done it too much harm. And is he saying the same thing about morals, that you can be so unjust and so self-indulgent for so long that you finally really can't come back?
Well, I'm going to go back to Catholic theology on it, because I just can't believe how much I've seen in this Aristotle. Because yes, sin in the Catholic Church, it's got to be great. Be a grave matter. You have to have sufficient reflection on it, and you have to have complete consent. And at that point, what we're talking about, I think, is habitual kind of. And that then that doesn't mean that those three requirements, where it's becoming a habit, whatever that may be, it's habitual. So even in the Catholic Church, that's they got the Aristotelian kind of concept. Their habit lessens the seriousness of it.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that even societally, as I reflect, we never really give up on anybody, not just related to addiction, to criminality. I don't really know where we say, well, just throw away the key. I guess we do that for people who had very heinous grounds, danger to society, but generally we always strive for rehabilitation. Whether we do it well is another issue. But I know there was, in the practice of medicine, we never said you had 3 rehab programs for alcohol or drugs. That's it. It does no good to serve you further. I never heard that.
Yeah. We always think you can make another try.
Right. And I'm thinking in 17th century England and in the very early 18th century, the number of crimes that resulted in hanging grew immensely and then dropped because they discovered transportation. We won't hang you, we'll send you to America or Australia as prisoners and let you start over again, but you'll be out of our way. Whether we hang you or send you overseas, same result for us. You're not doing that thing with us anymore. But it really cut back the hanging deaths dramatically. And again, a way of certainly transportation to another place gives the person another choice, another chance, where hanging doesn't. Other than maybe repentance at the very last minute. You can't lead a new life after you've been hanged.
It's a little hard, however, to think of that change as being sort of noble. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's solving the same problem for the community, but at least it's giving the prisoner a chance in America, and some did well.
Shifting it to another community.
Yeah, only it's and of course Australia was founded by transported people.
Yeah. Well, and keeping it out of the criminal realm, it does sound like he's saying, and we can imagine some of these people, if you really have formed bad habits your whole life so that you have made yourself self-indulgent, it may reach a point where it doesn't seem like there's any coming back. Because you have formed those pathways, and much as you might want to change, it has become very hard for you to do that. So yeah, the person who's the champion of habits also sees that it can go both ways. You can form the good habits, but if you form the bad habits, it's pretty hard to come back.
Yeah, it's habituation either way, is the way I'm reading.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, let's read his summing up, and then we'll get to the particular virtues of the day, which is courage and temperance. So his very last paragraph of section 5, where he actually says to sum up. And Ekagra, I don't know if you have You're able to go to that passage? It's at 11:15 or 11:14b30. To sum up?
I don't have the light number, sorry. So is it with regard to virtues in general, we have stated their genus and outline?
Yes, that is exactly there. So we have a slightly different translation, but yeah, pick it up right there.
With regard to
Our paragraph starts to sum up, just to place it for everybody else. Go ahead.
with regard to the virtues in general, we have stated their genus and outline, vis-a-vis that they are means and that they are states of character, and that they tend, and by their own nature, to the doing of the acts by which they are produced, and that they are in our power and voluntary, and act as the right rule prescribes. But actions and states of character are not voluntary in the same way, for we are masters of our actions from the beginning right to the end, if we know the particular facts. But though we control the beginning of our states of character, the gradual progress is not obvious any more than it is in illnesses. Because it was in our power, however, to act in this way or not in this way. Therefore, the states are voluntary. Let us take up the several virtues, however, and say which they are and what sort of things they are concerned with and how they are concerned with them. At the same time, it will become plain how many they are. And first, let us speak of courage.
Okay. So is there anything unclear in his summing up? We've kind of gone over the parts of this before. We are in control of our actions. Yeah. Sorry?
Keeping New Year's resolutions.
Well, he says we're in control.
Yeah, but what if the way we behave has become habitual, and I think we fall into that easily. Yeah, January must be a great month for gyms. The number of people who buy year-long memberships and are gone by now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, you've got to get a habit of going.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he does keep comparing it to the spread of a disease.
Yeah.
It's kind of a negative comparison, but I gather it works for both, good habits and bad habits.
The interesting thing to me when I read that phrase, the spread of a disease, is in his era, they didn't know germs. Remember that. So I'm not sure exactly how the Greeks thought about spread of disease other than by observation, obviously, probably, plagues and whatnot that have spread rapidly. But it just struck me that, they're not thinking what we think as we read that at all.
Mm-hmm.
If everybody is suddenly coughing and sneezing and sniffling.
It's probably the same result. There's something spreading. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
And, it'd be bad air or something like that, which...
Humors.
If the germs are floating in the air, yeah, it is bad air. They just don't know why. Or catching a cold from being chilled.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But you can see a little bit of him being the son of a doctor here, right. I think, in that you can guess that his father came home sometimes and said, if so-and-so had just exercised a little and eaten right. It wouldn't have come to this state that it's come to. There was, go back in time and he could have controlled this, but now, it can't be fixed. Yeah. Well, let's now go on to some specific virtues. He's actually kind of given us a prelude of this last week when we talked about the mean between extremes. So he sees courage, as he's already mentioned previously, as the mean between recklessness and cowardice. So too much fear is cowardice and too little fear is recklessness. And then courage is the mean. And in chapter 6, he talks about courage with regard to war. But in chapter 7, he talks about it more generally. And I want to take a look at his more general definition of what courage is and kind of talk it through. Let's see, Lauren, would you read at the beginning of section 7?
Now, the same things are not fearful to all people, and there are some things of which we say that they surpass human endurance. The latter are fearful, at least to every sensible person. The The terrors which are humanly bearable differ in magnitude and degree, and so do the circumstances that inspire confidence. Now, the courageous man is dauntless as a human being. Hence, he will fear what is fearful, but he will endure it in the right way and as reason directs for the sake of acting nobly. That is the end of virtue. It is, of course, possible to fear things to a greater or lesser degree, and also to fear what is not fearful. Errors arise from fearing what one should not, fearing in the wrong manner, fearing at the wrong time, and so on, and similarly with events that inspire confidence. Accordingly, he is courageous who endures and fears the right things for the right motive in the right manner and at the right time, and who displays confidence in a similar way. For a courageous man feels and acts according to the merits of each case and as reason guides him. Now, the end of every activity corresponds to the characteristic that produces it. This also applies to a courageous man. Courage is noble, and accordingly, its end is noble too. For a thing is defined by its end. Thus it is for a noble end that a courageous man endures and acts as courage demands.
Okay, let's stop there. It's interesting that in the previous section, and I'm trying to find examples, he's citing Homer when he's talking about courage in battle and what that means, and I think he quotes Homer in a couple places. But both he and Socrates want to extend courage and not have it be just about battles. So what do we make of this definition? He is courageous who endures and fears the right things for the right motive, in the right manner, at the right time, etc. For a courageous man feels and acts according to the merits of each case as reason guides him. Now, he doesn't give examples, but can we think of some? Fearing the right thing at the right time?
Well, you should, a prudent man would see if a person was on the railroad tracks and a prudent man saw a train coming, thought, should I save that person? He certainly should fear being hit and hurt by the train. That's sensible. You know, and the issue is, how does he act or not? So.
Okay, well, and let's take that situation. The reckless man wouldn't maybe think enough about, okay, but I could get hit by the train too. Like, I can save this person, but if I do this wrong, we just both die. The reckless man just runs in there, tries to save the person. If the timing is right, he does. If the timing is wrong, they both die. So the courageous man is fearing what's going to happen to the person who's about to be hit, but also presumably doesn't himself want to die. And if he can save the person without them both dying, he does so. And that's the courageous man. I take it the coward just stands there and says, I could get hit too, I'm not doing this.
What if he saves the person at the cost of his own life?
Ah.
Now that sounds like some of the battlefield kind of stuff.
So if he calculates, I can get there just in time to throw that person, but not fast enough to get away myself.
And just to make it pathetic enough, we'll make the person on the tracks a little kid.
Yeah.
Reaches in, throws the kid out, and gets hit by the train. He'll be in the newspapers.
That would be noble, I would think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, it would be easy to decide it's too late. But thinking of somebody else over yourself,
yeah,
with at least the possibility of saving the kid,
or
the person.
But whether he goes for both or whether he says goes, you know, if he tries to say both, whatever the result is not the point, because the end was noble. I mean, I think that's being said here. And, you know,
yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the motives are correct. You know, I agree with James. You know, and especially, you know, from a Christian viewpoint. You know, he who lays down his life for another. You know, so yes, I think that's courageous. I don't think it's reckless.
Mm-hmm.
Especially your example, Norm, with the child, the reckless factor you know, I think there's a recklessness factor, and it may be determined on what you're doing. That's with the child, you're more reckless.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if the train is right there at the child,
Mhm.
you jump in, that's reckless. It's not going to help.
Mm-hmm.
But if you
Right.
can see the train coming down the track and there's enough time to push the other person off, even if there's not enough time for you to get off.
Right, and you lose your life. It's
Yeah.
still courageous.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or if
Some
you
may,
trip on the
some may
track.
view it as reckless, but I think it's poor.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot of their worldview too. You know, their
Mhm.
point
Yeah.
of view.
Well, let's see if we can come up with an example that doesn't involve anyone dying. So fearing, I'm thinking, is there a more everyday example of someone who fears the right things for the right motive and displays confidence?
Maybe speaking up in in bullying, speaking up in a situation where someone is being bullied or harassed. Do I stick my neck out? Those are more likely situations.
Mm-hmm.
Whistleblowing.
I'm even thinking of events in the past.
whistleblowing.
All of the people, the women who signed on to Me Too.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit courageous to go public.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, and all of the cases you guys have given, there's fears on both sides.
Yeah.
Right, James. Somebody's being bullied. You might have to worry: if I step in, are they going to bully me? Or whistleblowing. There's something bad going on here, and I feel I should report it. But if I do, I'll probably lose my job,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even be threatened by my coworkers.
Mm-hmm.
So there's fears on both sides, but this idea of fearing the right thing, yes, you're fearful of losing your job, but let's talk about whistleblowers. They're not fearing the wrong thing. What are they fearing if they actually take the step?
Retribution.
And so that's one fear they have. But I'm wondering about this fearing the right thing. That's the tricky part of it.
I read it as fearing the right thing, meaning they're rational. They understand what the fear is, and in that instance, retribution. That's how I read it. Fearing the right thing, that you're right. You're right. You should be afraid of losing your job or retribution, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But the noble thing is to go ahead and do it.
Do it anyway. Whereas the coward would see the evidence of wrongdoing. Maybe even a part of him would say, yeah, I should do something about this, but I don't want to lose my job. And they let that fear rule them. And they don't do the right
thinking
thing.
of the Unabomber.
Yeah, with a brother.
Who was from Evergreen Park, down by where I am.
Mm-hmm.
Who was finally turned in by his brother.
Ah.
Who recognized the writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that had to take a bit of courage within a family situation. I mean, this guy's so bad that it's not as bad as turning in a beloved brother who's very close to you, has a wonderful family, but has done something wrong that nobody else has uncovered, but you have.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he probably didn't want to become in part of the public eye too. That's another thing, goes on, not so much with the retribution, but, I just wish life would go on just as normal. Most people don't want to get involved, but he had a moral compunction to get involved because of that. There's no other rational choice but to do what he did.
Yeah. Well, and then maybe another example like that you've all read would be Antigone.
Yeah.
There's the fear of the state. There's a law saying do not do this thing, do not bury this brother. Certainly her sister fears that and says, so therefore we cannot do this.
Mm-hmm.
And she does call her sister more or less a coward.
Yeah.
And then she does bury her brother. And, she claims that what she's more concerned about is the gods. And her meeting her brother in the afterlife. She wants to be able to look him in the eye because she did this action that she thinks is necessary. But she had overcome her fear of the state, fear of the death penalty, which is exactly what she got.
In that situation, would Socrates not have said that following the law is the right thing? Like, I'm just thinking of Crito. Doesn't he say that though you have a contract with the city, and if you follow the law, then that is the right thing to do? Well, if you think the law is wrong, then try to convince the law that it is wrong. And if you fail, then you should follow it, and that's the right thing to do.
Well, except you have to think about all the circumstances, like whose law, because there was a time when Socrates disobeyed the quote unquote law. He mentions it at his trial. The Apology, remember, he says when the 30 tyrants are in charge, so the democracy is not in existence, these 30 are running the state, and they call him in and a couple other people and say, go kill, I think it was Leon of Salamis. And he said they were doing a lot of that to implicate as many people as possible in their crimes, and he left there and went home. So you have been ordered by the leader of your state, whether it's Creon or the 30, to go and kill somebody. And he didn't do it. And he said if they'd stayed in power, he no doubt would have been executed for not carrying out an order of the state, a direct order from the state. But
he in Antigone, it's the state versus the gods, which is not clear in these other cases.
Yeah, well, Socrates might say it's the state versus my moral sense of what's right.
Right, yeah.
And I'm not going to kill a man just because my quote-unquote government tells me to. On the other hand, he might then make the argument that wasn't a democratically elected government.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, but it does sound like, the courageous man has to think about all these things. The right place, the right time. Maybe you change your action depending on a different time or a different place or a different person. There's, no one size fits all.
And Socrates is going to get buried. And ultimately, he's going to pay the cock to Aesculapius at the end of our program. So it's not involving, there's no body like there is in Antigone that could go wandering forever if she doesn't do it. So.
Yeah, for her, it's a religious duty.
Right.
Well, let's go on a little bit. I want to make sure we get at least a little bit into self-control. So he goes on to talk about some things that are mistaken for courage, and if we have time, we could go back to those. But self-control is the second virtue he deals with, and it's a mean in chapter 11 between self-indulgent and what he says there's almost not a word for it because it's insensitivity. And he gives maybe more or less a definition of self-controlled man at the end of that section 11. So maybe, Lauren, would you read that last paragraph? So we're at 11:19a:10. A self-controlled man.
A self-controlled man observes the mean in these matters. He takes no pleasure in what is most pleasant to the self-indulgent, but rather finds it disgusting. In general, he takes no pleasure in what he should not, and no excessive pleasure in touch and taste. He feels neither pain nor appetite, or only moderately, when he does not have these pleasures. He feels them no more than he should, nor when he should not, and so forth. But all the pleasant things that contribute to his health and well-being he desires moderately and in the way he should, and also other pleasures as long as they are neither detrimental to health and well-being, nor incompatible with what is noble, nor beyond his means. A man who does not observe these standards loves such pleasure more than they are worth, but a self-controlled man is of a different sort. He follows right reason.
Okay, let's talk a bit about this virtue. Courage is something people talked about then, talk about now. I'm not sure we really use this language, and I wonder if we could translate it into our terms. You don't tend to go, you might go, there's a courageous man, or read a story in the newspaper about the guy who jumps in and saves the kid, the railroad tracks, what a great guy, what a courageous guy. Do we really go around and say, wow, what a self-controlled man that is? Is that an excellence that we talk about? And if we do we use different language?
I think we say temperate. Not that we use that word a lot, but kind of temperate person. But And
Mm-hmm. So temperate might be more the modern terminology.
There's a footnote on page 77 that talks about self-control more of just not merely as restraint, but also as mastery. So
Mm-hmm.
somebody who's clearly in control of themselves, both positively and, doing the good things as well as not doing the bad things.
Mm-hmm.
I don't hear
Yeah. And in fact,
for it, but it
yeah. Yeah, let's try to understand that, because you're right. Self-control, which is the translator's word, sounds more negative.
Mhm.
It's a holding back, it's a restraint. And he says the Greek word sophrosune actually had both sides, the full knowledge of one's limitations in a positive as well as a negative sense. And I guess I'm trying to understand, what's the positive sense? Self-mastery, not just you can't do this or you're stopping yourself from that, but what would be the positive side of self-mastery?
I'm getting a phrase that might be modern, really in control of self.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that quite works. Now I'm hearing about kids who are getting out of control.
Out of control. Mm-hmm.
Just tantrum. So maybe there is something to it. I don't do particular things that could be bad, not because I'm trying to avoid them, but they're just not things I would do.
Mm-hmm.
And I would do some things not because they're good, but because, now, as long as I say because that's who I am, then it isn't really self-control.
Mm-hmm.
It's just being natural.
Or mastery would go beyond. Often when you think self-control, you think restrictive. You
Mhm.
restrict but it looks at both the negative and the positive. The things that you are good to do or should do, or that you've mastered your you've mastered your all aspects
Mm-hmm.
in a positive way. Not just what you don't do, but those things that you do are part of your full mastery of yourself.
Well, and let's talk about the do rather than the don't. So you might appreciate fine wine and good food and music. You don't overdo any of them, because then we head into self-indulgence. But you do appreciate them and enjoy them. So this would be somebody who's enjoying the pleasures of life, just never overdoing, or rarely overdoing.
And I could think of somebody, this puts money into it, but who could spend a lot of money on good food and good wine, but knows it needs to go somewhere else. So it's not that he doesn't have it. And so, okay, for our birthdays, we'll go out to a really good restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll enjoy what we enjoy once a year.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll look forward to it. And
Yeah.
we'll really enjoy it. But that doesn't mean we'll do it every week.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like that idea because it reminds me of a wonderful Ben Franklin saying. He was one who would actually list virtues and check himself. Am I doing these virtues on this day, and which ones do I need to work on more? So moderation was one of the ones he worked on, and his famous saying, "Moderation in all things, including moderation."
Right.
So, are there times to indulge? Absolutely,
Yes.
but not all the time.
I mean, to be on a diet on Thanksgiving Day means you're a little too worried.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't mean you have to have the third piece of pie when your stomach can't take it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But it's without excess, and sometimes very rare use of it is the only way it's not excessive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I hear echoes of what we were talking about earlier. If you like on the next page where it's talking about the page 81, the self-controlled man observes the meat of these matters. He takes no pleasure in what is most pleasant to the self-indulgent. But all the pleasant things that contribute to his health and well-being, he desires moderately in the way he should. So it's again kind of this wish or this desire for the right things. So it's not only do I stay away from the things that are bad for me, but I do have a natural desire for the right amounts of the things that are good for me. I'm not exercising because I know I have to, but I'm exercising because I actually enjoy it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And why would these two be the first two virtues he would talk about? You know, not that he said we're going in order of importance or anything like that, but I guess I'm wondering why these are the first two up. Courage and self-mastery. When we think of,
Go ahead.
yeah, go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to briefly say that my general impression is the Greeks greatly admired courageous people, and they greatly admired moderation. And this self-control sounds a lot like moderation to me.
Mm-hmm.
So it's consistent with what I thought were social, if not norms, viewed as desirable in the society.
Mm-hmm.
And at least courage, there are certainly foolhardy people out there, and if we think of it mainly in military terms, who rush in where they don't need to, ahead of everybody else. And there are certainly cowards who hold back.
Mm-hmm.
So coming out of a battle, who are the really courageous and who are the extremes? And all of them are there. And this is something that the culture knows about and pays a lot of attention to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think he's come out and said it yet, but the concepts of pain and pleasure seems like those are commonly misunderstood, because you can say cowardice and self-indulgence is kind of I don't know what that would be, converses of each other. Like self-indulgence is giving too much to pleasure, cowardice is withdrawing too much from pain.
Yeah,
and now
that's nice.
The reference, but really saying, yeah, you don't understand pain and pleasure for what they actually are.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting take, that these first two virtues really emphasize having the right relationship to pain and pleasure. And that's maybe one of the most important things that you can do if you're going to be an excellent human being. You got to have the right relationship to pain and pleasure. Any final thoughts? We've got just a minute or two before we...
My final thoughts, I'm just so pleased with the instructors and the classmates. Everybody very knowledgeable. The instructors are very, I think really happy to be here, and it shows their enthusiasm. So I'm having a good time. I'm reading things I was supposed to have read in high school and college, but either or saw the movie instead. Finally, this is the only way I would ever do it. Is this kind of a scenario?
Oh, great. Well, I always think of Robert Hutchins and Adler. They were the two that changed or added the great book sort of curriculum at the U of C. And Hutchins was given to saying education is wasted on the young. He sort of felt like your interest in these things is much greater when you get older. When you're young, there's too much else going on in your life to pay enough attention to the ethics, for example.
Now, Cynthia, I take that with all, the kindness in your heart. I do have 11 grandchildren, so the point's well taken.
Okay.
So.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
and I could just say, the instructors we've met, there are more to come.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's some good ones out there you haven't met yet. Yes, it's true.
Yeah.
Okay. So for next time, book 4, we're going to be looking at generosity and ambition. So those are our virtues for next week. So
and
And that kudos went to all my classmates too.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
This is good.
Great.
Good group.
It's
Really good.
Yeah. It
For
helps to
folks.
talk about these things and get different
I wish
Appreciate
my
viewpoints.
it.
students would talk
Yeah.
like this, but then education is wasted on the young.
Okay. Well, see you all till next
Yeah.
week.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Thanks,